Hi, hola, and good day. This is Reading Buckets, and today I'm going to read Shapes, Lines, and Light, My Grandfather's American Journey, written by Katie Yamasaki and illustrated by Katie Yamasaki. Let's read what this book is about. Katie Yamasaki's newest picture book celebrates the life of her grandfather, the acclaimed Japanese-American architect Minoru Yamasaki. Minoru Yamasaki described the feeling he thought to create in his buildings as serenity, surprise, and delight. Here, Katie Yamasaki charts his life and work, his childhood in Seattle's Japanese immigrant community, paying his way through college working in Alaska's notorious salmon canneries, his success in architectural school, and the transformative structures he imagined and built. A Japanese-American man who faced brutal anti-Asian racism in post-World War II America and an outsider to the architectural establishment. He nonetheless left his mark on the world, from the American Midwest to New York City, Asia, and the Middle East. This striking picture book renders one artist's work through the eyes of another, and tells the story of a man whose vision, hard work, and humanity led him to the pinnacle of his field. Shapes, Lines, and Light, My Grandfather's American Journey, written by Katie Yamasaki, illustrated by Katie Yamasaki. Jacket design by Hana Anouk Nakamura. Jacket art by Katie Yamasaki. Book design by Hana Anouk Nakamura. Production manager by Julia Druskin. Let's read the dedication for Pop, Uncle Taro, and in loving memory of Auntie Carol. Let's turn the page. Old people, it turns out, were not always old, not even grandparents. I learned that about my grandfather, Minoru. He was an architect, and I called him Grandpa. My grandma called him Tinky. Some people called him Min, and the world called him Yama. Before he was my grandpa, he was a kid, a teenager even, a young man trying to find his way through the world. A lot of the world happened to him, and he happened to a lot of the world. When Yama was young, he noticed a feeling in his chest that changed from space to space. In his rickety home, in his crowded neighborhood, and with his mother, father, and brother, he felt welcome. He felt curious and open. He felt seen. But there were other spaces, buildings that closed the open place in his heart. Spaces that said, "You are not welcome here, not your kind." Perhaps you will stock shoes for a store like your father. But there was a quiet voice inside Yama. "My father is brilliant." Perhaps you will sweep factory floors on weekends like your father. The quiet voice spoke again. "My father works hard." Perhaps architecture is too far a reach for someone like you. Yama listened to the quiet voice. "You have no idea how far I can reach." Yama went instead to spaces where he felt welcome. Forests deep with evergreen, streams that sang him a calming song, sunlight glinting off rocks, spaces of light and freedom ignited his imagination. He worked harder than everyone else, swallowing the sharp ache that came from not being seen. Faces like his in places like this. He listened to that quiet voice inside. "I will go to college and build my life." But there was no money. Only freezing cold far away, north, way north, Alaska. Sweeping vistas, glittering waters, and dark canneries that reeked of rotten fish. No fresh air, no light, no rest, working 18-hour days. So many Nisei like him, those born in America to parents who had come from Japan. Is this where they think we belong? I am building I am saving. Every summer, Yama went to Alaska and paid his way through college. Yama studied for many years. He stayed at the top of his class. Beautiful drawings, ideas like gardens growing in his mind. He was something special. But when it was time to get a job, America was in the middle of the Great Depression. Doors slammed, not hiring. Especially eyes like yours, names like yours, faces like yours. And when he did get a job designing buildings, the world still told him, "We do not trust your Japanese name, your Japanese face." Have you ever tasted something bitter in your mouth? That's how they said Japanese. He kept working harder than anyone else. He married a pianist named Teruko. The soulful sound of her music found its way into his work. Just after they wed, war began. Japanese families on the west coast of the United States lost everything. They were sent to desert prisons. Yama and Teruko's tiny New York City apartment overflowed with family, escaping. The FBI said, "You are Japanese, suspicious." The police said, "You are Japanese, show us your identification." The neighbors said, "You are Japanese, you could be a spy." I was born in Seattle. I am building my life, just like you. Every bitter sound made a brick. Each brick built a stronger foundation. He added lines. He didn't want to feel the way they were trying to make him feel. He made shapes. He brought in light. He had a family, a Japanese-American family, that needed a place to live. First, they were turned away, again and again. But then, they found a home, an old farmhouse in a town without red lines and cruel rules. They built and they grew. At his office, Yama worked and wondered, how can I make a space of light with a feeling of open doors? An air that breathes, everyone is welcome here. Shapes combined with lines combined with nature's light. Serenity, surprise, delight. Yama became his own boss, signed his own drawings, made buildings where people worked in harmony, where people worked in peace. For many years, he worked long, hard hours, too long, too hard. He worked until his body said, "Rest now." So he traveled and marveled, soared, said the quiet voice inside, as his spirit lifted into the arcs of the Alhambra. "Peace like this," it said, as he beheld sun glinting on still water and path of smooth round stones at the Katsura Palace. Inspired, Yama returned to fill his office with big thinkers from around the world, architects who worked side by side. People from many countries called Yama, asking him to design their buildings. The spaces he built connected to the humanity of everyday people. Workplaces, learning spaces, travel hubs, and sacred spots to gather were filled with serenity, surprise, and delight. His work grew, his name grew, the pressure upon him that grew too. He made mistakes and had regrets that will take him time to fully understand. People he worked with didn't always agree or share his visions. Things didn't always work out the way he planned. But so often, Yama found his way, bringing the outside world in, letting the sun shine through ceilings, illuminating shapes, the reflecting water of a still pool, quieting a busy mind, so one might sit in peace. His shapes, lines, and light brought to so many serenity, surprise, and delight. And there was home, a home he made of shapes and lines and light, a home filled with Tekuro's music, a home that was filled with children and then grandchildren. Many years later, a terrible thing happened. But he had died years before. If he had been alive, his heart would have broken into 1,000,000 pieces, not for the buildings, but for all the people who went to work there in peace, for all their families, and for what happened afterward. I lived there then in New York City, and it made me wonder, what do buildings stand upon? There is the earth, the soil, the concrete, the steel beams. There are our stories. And the feeling we have in that space that is made from shapes and lines and light. Author's note: it is hard to fit an entire life into the pages of a picture book. My grandfather had a big life, full of profound challenges, stunning achievements, and everyday moments. Born to immigrants, he grew up in a country that didn't trust him, didn't have space for him, didn't see him. He decided to change that. He will make space. He will be seen. Minoru Yamasaki was born December 1st, 1912, in Nimohachi, Seattle's bustling Japantown. He described his first home, a precariously perched tenement in the Yesler Hill section, as apt to slide down the slope to the street below at any moment. The family had only cold water and an outhouse out back. Although the conditions were primitive, he remembered that period of his life, surrounded by a vibrant community of other industrious, creative Japanese and Japanese Americans, as a time of fun and adventure. Outside was another world. Minaru and his friends were not allowed to swim in the public swimming pools, except at the YMCA, and were relegated to watching movies from the upper balconies, even when the entire theater down below remained empty. Minoru's father, Sunhiro John, worked multiple jobs throughout Minoru's childhood, stocking shoes on weekdays and cleaning the floors of a chocolate factory on weekends, which enabled the family to move into better housing. In school, Minoru was at the top of his class, without knowing what path he will follow, until a visit from his uncle Kuken, who had graduated with a degree in architecture from the University of California and was headed to Chicago to begin his first job. It was during that visit that he unrolled some drawings, and Minoru almost exploded with excitement. From that moment on, he knew he would become an architect. Minoru studied architecture at the University of Washington under Lionel Priest, who encouraged him even during times when he didn't know if the career was the right choice. To pay for school, Minoru and his brother Ken, after him, worked in the salmon canneries of Alaska, one of the few places that will hire young Nisei men. The conditions he described there were dehumanizing, physically dangerous, filthy, infested, and exploitative. Minoru graduated with one of the best grades records in the history of the architecture school. Prior to the year of his graduation, the school had always awarded the top students a scholarship to study at the Society of Beaux-Arts in Paris. But that year, it canceled the scholarship so as not to grant it to Minoru. Greatly upset by this act, Sunhiro took the family on a trip to Japan that they could barely afford. The architecture and aesthetic of Japan impacted Minoru greatly. The exchange between the natural world and human-made structures remained with him and became a foundational principle in his own work. Minoru moved to New York City in 1934. It was the Great Depression. Anti-Asian sentiment was high. No one was hiring architects, much less Japanese American architects from a public university. Eventually, he was brought on to a team to help make drawings for a competition. The firm won the competition and hired Minoru, thus beginning his career as a full-time architect. Soon after, the United States entered World War II, and after moving to a different firm, Minoru was assigned to design the Samson Naval Station in upstate New York. Despite having been thoroughly investigated by the FBI, the Army, and the Navy, he still recalled being turned away at the gate by military police who saw him as a security threat. On December 5, 1941, Minoru married my grandmother, Teruko, who was on a full scholarship at the Juilliard School of Music to become a concert pianist. 2 nights after their wedding, on the night of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Teruko's father, Uncle, was arrested and sent to a military prison, having been deemed dangerous because he was part owner of a produce market. Because their family business was lost in one instant and their home in the next, Teruko, her sister Aki, and her brother Jimmy all had to drop out of school. Aki, Jimmy, and their mother, Toshi, were sent to a camp in Colorado. Minoru's parents, with the help of Minoru's bosses at the architecture firm, were able to escape Seattle and travel to New York City, narrowly avoiding the mass incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans from the West Coast for the duration of World War II. Teruko and Minoru spent the years of the war in their one-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan with Minoru's parents and brother Ken. It was a brutal time to be Japanese in the United States, but they were supported by Minoru's architecture firm and treated well by their landlord, who never raised their rent or met them with anything other than kindness as their tiny apartment overflowed with family escaping. After the war, Minoru worked at various architecture firms and eventually found himself in Detroit. He was respected and well paid, but he was prohibited from buying a home in what were considered the city's best suburbs because he was Japanese. He, Teruko, and his parents settled on an old farmhouse in Troy, Michigan, where they raised my Aunt Carol, Uncle Taro, and my father, Kim. When Minoru created his own office, Yamasaki and Associates, in 1959, he was determined to hire the best architects from around the world and create a vibrant, healthy work environment where the brightest minds could do their best work. When years later he won the commission to design the World Trade Center, all of a sudden he had to grow his small office to accommodate the demands of the project. The responsibility of being an employer to a much larger staff wasn't anything he took lightly. He was steadfast in his devotion to his employees, who returned that loyalty in the work they did for the firm. Minoru was consumed by the idea of making buildings that created feelings of uplift and what he described as serenity, surprise, and delight. At that time, trends in architecture were to use new technology to overwhelm, intimidate, or amaze. Minoru wanted to use shapes and structures at a human scale that created a feeling of peace. He was interested in how the new technology could work with what we knew from architectural tradition of the past. He especially drew inspiration from forms found in nature, Islamic architecture, the great cathedrals of Europe, and in the interplay between buildings and the natural world found in the traditional architecture of Japan. Although highly successful by any measure, Minoru was sometimes harshly criticized by the architecture world. Reviews of his buildings that could only be described as racist will start out by talking about his body, his small frame, and his decorative approach to his buildings. He will describe the emotional experience of a space and the shapes and light that can achieve that, and critics will call him frivolous. Reading those reviews was painful for him and took its toll over time. In the context of the anti-Japanese hostilities during his lifetime, I often find it hard to separate some critics of his work from the fact that he was a Japanese-American man who did not come from the privileged white world of the architecture establishment. It was a surprise for me to learn that my grandfather's work was not often taught in architecture schools, and that he was mostly known for the World Trade Center and for the terrible, troubled, and complex public housing experiment, the Pruitt-Igoe apartment in St. Louis, Missouri. It seemed wrong that someone with such a legacy could be known primarily for the two projects that least represented who he was as a human being and as an architect. I also knew how esteemed he was in the Japanese-American community and how he was seen as a symbol of hope and success for so many who had lost everything during World War II. To this day, Japanese-American elders tell me how much Grandpa has meant to them and their families, and I know that his role in the community was not something he took lightly. I have wanted to write this story for a long time. When I was growing up, I didn't want to become an artist because I felt the pressure to do something great like my grandfather, or be able to play the piano like my grandmother, or win the Pulitzer Prize like my Uncle Taro. It was too much. But as I got older, I realized that what I loved were stories, and finding ways to tell stories that don't often get told. Stories that help us shine a light on something that we all need to see a little more clearly. Grandpa always told my dad that drawing was simply looking carefully, truly seeing something. This book is my attempt to draw the story of his life and work, to take the time to see him a little more clearly. Thank you for listening to Shapes, Lines, and Light, my grandfather's American journey, written by Katie Yamasaki, illustrated by Katie Yamasaki. Jacket design by Hana, Anouk, Nakamura. Jacket art by Katie Yamasaki. Book design by Hana, Anouk, Nakamura. Production manager Julia Druskin. This is Reading Buckets. Bye!